user groups spawned all over the world. And it's like I was really riding on a high. Huge blog. I get 150,000 views when I posted stuff. So I mean, I was like a celebrity programmer for a minute there.
If you don't mind, could you refresh what is Dojo and how do you see it? Because there are some books written on this topic, and I'm sure you have your own authentic view of what Dojo is and how it should be implemented philosophically and practically.
Yeah, sure. So Dojo for me is a kind of environment where usually software development teams or digital product teams can come into the dojo, and for a period of weeks, usually 6 weeks, um, the teams kind of work with coaches that kind of know what they're doing, usually like product coaches or engineering coaches, DevOps coaches, and the teams, work on their real backlog, on their real problems, while learning new skills and techniques. And the aim of this is to really help them make better product decisions, and to kind of optimize their productivity, speed, quality, things like that. So it's kind of a little bubble. Teams come in, and the focus is really on learning over delivery. It's kind of one of the principles that we have, but we often see that better delivery, just better quality and fit of delivery, and comes as a happy side effect of really focusing on building your skills. So that 6 week time period, we break that up into 12 little iterations. And so we also learn to size things small. We also really stress the making things visual and external to us, so that we have a shared representation, not just like we're debating about it and we have different ideas in our respective heads. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And like what we do is we go help clients set these environments up in their organization, and really figure out what impacts they're trying to make and how to measure that, and really get a demand, basically a conversion funnel to bring teams in to that and engage in this, and then measure what was the impact of their experience. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how I view it.
What I picked up for myself working with you is that it's the first time where I saw quite significant emphasis, among other things, was on development of feature set and stories, not from perspective of, I guess, stakeholder, but from more actually engineering perspective. Basically, implementation starts with requirements, like concrete requirements, and filtering out all the bullshit that doesn't have to be there, and also questioning the even feature itself, like what makes you think it's have to be in production, right? And two, what you already alluded to is that taking something that team is working normally day to day and working on that thing under new light, right? Which gives you stakeholder approval and blessing, right? Because you sort of delivering something maybe slower than you normally would be from their perspective, not from our perspective. We care about quality usually more because that prevents bugs and prevents time spent fixing them, retesting them, and so forth. And again, questioning whether those features even have to be there, because what if it's just a waste of time?
Yeah. Yeah. So oftentimes Dojo brings together these multiple disciplines that it really, we could call it a product team, but to me, a product team is a team that's fully capable, right? Fully capable from generating ideas to, testing those ideas through, product discovery techniques or research, or, going out and talking to customers, or testing those ideas through shipping, things down a continuous deployment pipeline. But it's really the nature of that team is that they're fully autonomous, right? And that's kind of, to me, the holy grail of, and what helps Dojo, where Dojo helps is getting these teams where you've got a product manager role, you've got engineering roles, you've got maybe a designer, and they're pretty much a fully functional battle station. They can do everything on their own. They may take inputs from their stakeholders, and certainly they're going to listen to their customers and that's going to govern their success, right? But you can contrast that with, kind of life in the enterprise, which has been very much like handoff driven, right? And so you've got one group of people that make the product decisions, and then they ship over requirements over the wall to a bunch of engineers that, are the people that work on this stuff the longest. So they have the most time to really analyze it and scrutinize it and be like, what is bullshit? And so they're smart people too. They're analytical, right? And so you tend to get this kind of friction. Whereas if we collapse those two groups together and really make them work as a proper team, you can see Voltron in my background. I mean, that's on purpose. Like, we're really trying to get to where that whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and how we collaborate. And some of those skills, will be technical or product discovery skills, but a lot of those skills are in the domain of, the fuzzy, squishy life sciences domain, right? Where it's like collaboration, communication, storytelling, all that kind of comes along. So there's a lot of skills that we kind of bring to bear in that transition from a very functional based teams or feature teams or whatever to this kind of, what we say, like a promised land of a products team, and there's, your competitors are acting this way now, right? And so you look at big tech, and they have product and services teams that are pretty autonomous, and how they kind of organize their leadership. Their management is in service to that team's productivity, versus kind of the old school way of, hierarchical and top down. So in a way, what we're really doing with Dojo is changing culture, right? And we're changing culture from, a highly functional, role-driven bureaucracy, right, to a more generative kind of network, flat, collaborative culture, where there's a lot of psychological safety, and there's a lot of autonomy in individual actors in that culture, developers or, whatever. So, I mean, a lot of words. It sounds kind of crazy, but it's pretty simple when you think about it. It's like, we're working this way. How can we rig better to work in a way that promulgates, more satisfaction, so you can kind of get to impacts like attracting and retaining the best talent? That's a big deal for leaders, especially in the Great Resignation, and, like creating an environment where people want to do work and they feel like they're connected to that purpose. Creating an environment where, teams have those degrees of freedom, right? And they have the tools to know how to change depending on how their mission changes or what they're trying to do changes. And that starts to de-emphasize roles a little bit, put skills up there a little bit more, and shared skills. And, it's good old fashioned risk management too. Someone wins the lottery, how much do they own this component, right? It's like, we've all seen that component. We've all contributed to that component. So lots of benefits there. But, when you boil it down simple, it's a place for teams to come to learn to develop better products faster. And to me, product is part of it, as you kind of mentioned.
I really can relate to your description of atomic teams. I picked up for myself this concept quite early on. I'm not talking about time specifically, but my personal development as a consultant. I realized that, wow, we can really package teams in a way that they don't need anybody else. They can go from from requirements to production themselves. No need to submit a ServiceNow ticket for deployments, any of that nature. And what we've done in Dojo, working with you together, was what I really appreciate was how we've been swapping roles. Who would be technical today? Who would be talking today? Who would be driving today? And just general principles like action over discussion, and keep on repeating and kind of putting in their minds engineering principles. Like, for example, another concept like outcome versus output, right? We focus in not about how many lines of code you write, but what's the outcome. Maybe we don't even need these lines of code to start with.
Maybe deleting lines of code is the answer.
Exactly.
So, yeah, no, it's really, it's an inversion of control, right? Of the classic, like I said, there's this model out there called the Westrum typology. And it's big in DevOps, right? But essentially it's a way of thinking about where your culture is in the organization. On one side, it's like pathological, where it's like messengers are shot and like collaboration's discouraged and all that. And the middle is where generally we're working, which is bureaucratic, where it's just kind of top down
Remind me
commanding.
that book, something typology.
It's called the Westrum typology, Westre.
I remember first it started as a blog post or something, and then they actually wrote the book about it, and then it became pretty popular. Maybe we're talking about the same thing, but I definitely remember it's called like a team topology or something like that, where they've been describing how in variety of organizations dynamics between team and stakeholders can play out.
That's a great book. The Team Topologies is a great book if you really want to understand, like, if you're a pattern-minded person, which I am, and you
Same
kind
for
of
me.
want to understand how you can rig, oftentimes in the enterprise, what we're trying to do are big things, right? We're creating, like, microservices architectures, or we're creating complex distributed systems, which I guess is what microservices architecture was called before it was called microservices architecture. But we're creating big ecosystems that are really complex or chaotic even, right? And so team topologies gives you a nice vocabulary for understanding how the relationships between teams, and they've got this whole, like, okay, you're a stream aligned team, you're aligned to a value stream. That's really good, and you should put that in your notes for sure. What I'm talking with Westrum's typology is organizational culture. So rather than organizational design and how different units interact, it's really the overriding set of mores and principles and expectations and the vibe, if you will, of that organization. So it's a cultural typology. And in that one, you've got three pillars: pathological culture. These are like your, if I think of like, Uber had problems with this, right? Where it was very toxic masculinity and stuff like that. And I think they've, tried to
blame culture, right? Finger pointing.
exactly, pathological, right? It's just shitty, right? Bureaucratic is a little bit more like, okay, they're functional. This tends to be where we work, right? But bureaucratic is like, okay, there's a big boss, and that boss is a boss, and you've got a layer cake of 6 VPs that trickle down to a layer cake of 3 directors that trickle down to a manager, and eventually you get down to the team. And it's, it's kind of like this telephone game to get anything done. And it's, we've experienced this, right, in consulting, where it's like, oh, you're going to get your laptop in 2 months or something like that, right? Or whatever. But it's like, it's a bureaucracy. And that's kind of how these big organizations, and there's a lot of waste inherent in that, but they kind of mistake the need for some governance and compliance tracking for the need for this big overblown bureaucracy. So we're fighting against that. But what we're trying to get to is that third column in Westrum's typology called generative, right? And this is where, you have highly, I'm just cribbing off this thing right now, but you have highly cooperative cultures. This is where messaging between teams, and this is where team topologies could kind of come in there. But the way teams interact, there's a training, and there's a protocol, and there's an etiquette for that interaction, right? Working agreements, or kind of think of the Amazon thing, where AWS thing, where all teams will interact through APIs. I mean, that's an extreme example of that. Risks are kind of shared across the group. Failure kind of leads to inquiry, and like failure we kind of see as tuition in learning. And bridging across groups is highly encouraged, and novelty is cherished, right? And this is kind of the idea, and that those organizations tend to be really flat. And by that I mean, rather than a strict organizational hierarchy, there's almost an inversion where these autonomous teams are at the forefront of working with customers and users and stuff like that, and the management becomes a kind of support structure for those teams to thrive, right? And things like quality of life become important to those managers, and things like development and getting people to kind of realize their full potential become really important to managers, and managers start to exhibit coach like behaviors and activities, right? And that's, in my mind, that is what I'm trying to do, is work with a bureaucratic culture to make it more generative or network or collaborative or whatever you want to call it. Westrum calls it generative, which is, it's hard to understand really what that means, but you generate value. You generate value through, permissible interactions and stuff like that. It sounds a little hippie. I mean, I'll admit that, but That's how I run, that's how I try to lead, these transformations. I'm in a strategy role, right? And, when I'm working with you, you're an engineering coach. I'm a strategy consultant, right? And I'm really trying to engage you in the strategy process as well, right? So I think the way we run these transformations, we have to be exemplars of what we're trying to get to. We can't act bureaucratically if we're trying to change bureaucracy, if that makes sense.
Lead by example, right?
Yeah. So let's take an example of us working together, right? You were working with a team, you found several issues with the team that were beyond the sphere of control of the team. You came to me and said, Dave, this needs to change, and I need you to talk to their leadership. And you literally delegated a strategy task to the strategists, right? That's generative, right? That's a generative thing. You're like, I need this. You need to remove these obstacles from my path so I can be successful here. You very clearly laid it out. I wish more people would behave that way. They're like, this got changed, this got changed, this got changed. Go figure it out. I'm like, okay. So I go over and I talk to the leaders and I'm like, hey, we're having, attention or attendance issues. People aren't really committed to this. Here, I'd suggest we rally them this way, and it kind of help complete that picture. But like, that's an example of generative culture where I am, ostensibly in charge of the transformation, but I'm not calling all the shots. I'm supporting the people that are working with the teams to move obstacles out of the way. That's how generative leadership works, I think, in my mind, so.
Some time ago, maybe when I was thinking Disney, I remember I was doing my day-to-day activities and I was typically listening podcasts. So back then I came across this idea of, maybe I recall it named differently or incorrect, but I think it was called a reverse pyramid. Basically, the leader is propagating up rather than down the, I guess, happiness of the organization. Like, hey, at the very top, they basically put what typically is at the bottom to the very top and treat them as the most important. Like, hey, engineer, what do you need? How can I make your day-to-day pleasant and satisfactory, right?
Yeah. So, in those bureaucratic organizations, one of the things that you'll see is that you've got the top leadership level at the top, right? You've got in the middle, you've got this kind of, middle management, right? Directors, managers. And at the bottom, you've got all the kind of developers or, product managers or whatever, that kind of thing. And what you see is this kind of communication patterns where people at a lower level seldom have access to people at the top level. And I think there's many problems to this. The first thing is, I think if you're at the top and developers are down, if I'm the CTO and I'm up here and my developers are down here and I'm in a big organization, we're talking thousands of engineers, right? Or it's very easy to get disconnected and be like, I spend most of my time in the board, but I don't really know what's happening with my developers. I don't know what level of disgruntlement they're having, burnout.
Here comes the reports, weekly, daily reports.
Yeah, yes. But it's like always filtered through this middle layer. And it's like, and in my mind, and I understand that it's very hard to scale yourself, especially at that size, like if you're a CTO. But it's this kind of idea from the lean world of doing a Gemba walk. Gemba is a Japanese word that simply means going to the place. I think that's what it means, going to the place. But the idea is like top leaders, and it comes from Toyota, and Toyota will actually go down to the factory floor and take a look and see what's happening, right? And I think that's one small example of how, you can kind of flatten that leadership, or you can become a more effective leader by developing a sense of what's going on, amongst the teams, right? And so Dojo helps with that a little bit, and it puts it into one place where leaders can come through and see what's happening. It creates an environment where we can see what are the big kind of obstacles in an organization and maybe start doing something about it with our close connection to leadership. So it's like all about flattening that down and creating that perspective. So if you think about like one of the activities, a leader is responsible for, it's to set a vision, right? And effective visions have this quality where when people hear the vision, they can kind of imagine where they fit into that vision, right? They can understand how they enroll to that vision. They can understand their piece in seeing that vision done. And this is kind of like you're getting into Daniel Pink territory here, but this is really that kind of like drive, autonomy, mastery, purpose, right? Dojo helps build autonomy in the teams. I mean, sorry, mastery over skills and tools, right? It also helps build those more autonomous product teams that are having more degrees of freedom and making more decisions about what they should develop or should not develop, or what ideas they should kill, or what ideas they should promote into production. But also purpose, right? If we can flatten that organization, we can create a clear purpose and say, you're doing this in fulfillment of this vision that is nicely articulated. So it all kind of goes, together.
It also helps to inspire folks, because once they feel like so excitement about their role, how they participate in delivering on a vision, and they see themselves actually being excited. Like, it's okay, you can brainwash people, but people at the end of the day understand whether they belong to this mission or not, or product or not. And if you can articulate something that would excite them, I think that's a big catch here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dave,
So
go ahead, sorry.
Well, I mean, that's what we're trying to do. It's hard, it's hard work, but we're getting better at it. So go ahead.
I wanted to cover how COVID disrupted your typical approach to things. And that could be Dojo itself, setup, how day-to-day was disrupted with regards to implementing things, how companies maybe start look differently at the offering of the Dojo. What was your challenges and how did you solve them, approach them?
So, maybe some of your viewers kind of inferred this, but Dojo is this high touch, place. It literally started as physical locations. Like the first one was really at Target, and it was like a whole floor of the company. And it was really cool because you had all the platform engineering groups over on the side, like developing the pass, and
literally over the wall, right?
Literally, but if you needed something, you could just walk over and be like, hey guys, this is broken, or I don't understand how to do this, and then come over and help you. And so it's like that change, right? Of course we went into this suddenly remote, and I think for us as a consultancy, our first priority was kind of secure your bag. It's like we had big contracts. Not all of them, I mean, some of them just pulled the plug straight up, but we were able to sustain most of them. I remember the dojo we were working in, we kind of showed up right in March of 2020, right? It's that first part of March where everyone didn't really know what was coming, and the policies hadn't deployed, like in terms of no travel, and we're like, this is the last trip we're making to this client.
Yep.
What we did is we simulated running it from our hotel rooms to build confidence there, right? So we said, well, we're going to do a week of dojo from we actually traveled to the site. We were just in the hotel room, but we're going to have the people, the squad or whatever, be working remotely. So we did that to build confidence with the client and just test it. We were pretty quick to respond. I think my business partner, she's very current events oriented, and so she kind of had us thinking about this in February, which was, I think, ahead of the curve, right, for the enterprise. So we started working on policies, tool chain. Like, we don't have whiteboards and big monitors, so we're going to use Zoom and Slack or Teams and Mural. Yeah, things like that, right? So we kind of punted really quickly, and we're able to maintain most of our book, right? Our book of business. We didn't lose too much. Some companies are just going to see a global crisis and they're going to instantly pucker up. They're going to basically reduce their expenditures. It's just EBITDA focused kind of, mentality, and that's fine. But so we did survive that initial leap. Then we got into it, and what we've done is basically taken the physical and tried to port that to the virtual one-to-one. And this is kind of there's this great term called skeuomorphic design. You can use that anytime you really want to sound important at a dinner party, but skeuomorphic design is like that design where it's like we have a digital product, but we made it look like it's analog reality. So a lot of this you see in like in music production, you'll see these like plugins and stuff, and they're all like wood grained with like aluminum knobs, but it's just a UI, right? So we kind of did that, right, for Dojo in the virtual world, and we observed that it wasn't working. And like I'll give you one example is we use this mob programming, ensemble programming technique where it's like everyone's focused on the same problem at the same time on the same screen. And we do rotations of driver and navigator through a group of 3 to 5 people. That's great, but when you're doing it remotely, you got to get really fast at get handoffs, right? So if everyone's working off their own branch, that forces to trunk-based development, right? We're getting a little nerdy here. And the other thing is now everyone is all of a sudden remote, and not everyone has like the environment that, I have. Like I'm in a bedroom in my house. It's sound treated. I've got a really nice camera. I've got really good audio. I'm living the life, right? A lot of people are just like at their, breakfast nook with their kids hanging off them, you know what I mean? And they're either having to be teachers. And so my empathy went from like, children are meant to be seen and not heard, whatever, to like, oh my God, I feel for you. Like, let's make this work, right? And it really definitely was a humanizing experience for me because, but just growth, right? But I mean, basically learning to like, okay, we need to have more asynchronous time, right? Where we're not together or we're more, so in a way we were developing opinions about remote working. Just because we're consultants doesn't mean we know everything, right? We sometimes act that way, but we definitely had to be like, oh, our expectations about what's possible in this need to change dramatically. And that led us into things like, well, what works in this medium? Like, for example, like cameras on. I used to be kind of a, kind of a fascist about cameras on, mics open. That's how we work. But that's a very in-person way of working. And what I've learned is like, actually, when I'm coaching a group and they don't put the cameras on, we can have a fine engagement. And you know what? I should turn my camera off to kind of level, to get at their, level. And then when we get into smaller groups, sometimes those cameras pop on. It's a more like the big team. So little lessons like that, I think were really profound. And now we're just like, okay, now I think we all accept that this is the way forward. And now we're like, okay, how do we design things with this as an enabling constraint, right? Not a friction, right, type constraint. Like, how do we accept that constraint and build and design things around it and that leverage that constraint? And so that's led us to, a number of innovations in the approach, namely lots more self-directed learning time, right? Lots more. When we get together, we really have a high fidelity experience, but that's not maybe going to be the majority of the time of that collaboration time, right? Things like leaning on chat ops a lot more, right? Things like we do still do mob programming and we try to kind of make that a centerpiece, but maybe we'll do that in the mornings. In the afternoon, what we'll do is like, I just was working with a team and said, well, let's try concurrent set-based design. Let's all do the same story this afternoon and come back in the morning and just compare results and see if we get, what happens there, right? And so that could be perceived as an efficiency waste, but the learning opportunities are profound. So a couple of examples, of how we have changed.
So correct me if I'm wrong, bulk of your life you spent in New York. That's where you grew up, right? And then you switched to Atlanta. And I believe that somehow was driven by your work at version 1, right?
Yep.
Could you speak about how it all started for you and kind of what did you miss about New York and what you was happy to leave behind and what you appreciate about living in Atlanta? And also your experience at driving version 1 from the start to growing in a big organization under your leadership?
Yeah. I lived, I grew up in upstate New York on a big dairy farm, and so I was kind of a farmer boy. But I always was drawn to the city. Like I knew I would end up there. And so this first opportunity I got and moved to Manhattan and and I was also very like obsessed with what's cool, right? And so of course I moved to Lower East Side and East Village, and it was like that to me was the coolest place in the world.
So you always had a vision. You want to be in a big city. You want to live in these neighborhoods. You want to do cool things, right?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I'm a culture vulture, right? I was a reader, and any could consume theater or cinema or anything like that. That's my passion, is like that kind of stuff. So, New York. I mean, we grew up going there, right? And it was always this crazy place, and it's got this air mystique about it. I think in the U.S. anyway, where it's like I think all over, but it's kind of this giant megalopolis, right? And so growing up in a small dairy farm in a town of 3,500 people, it really was the opposite. And I think that's kind of what you want when you're a kid, is you want anything but what you have. It's kind of the vibe. I'm old enough to recognize that and can appreciate my upbringing, which was awesome. I had
Made you
horses.
humble, right? Early on, made you humble.
I don't know if I'm humbler, I'd say, but yeah, I definitely was cool upbringing, horses and four-wheelers and toys and all that kind of hunting and all that fishing, all that good stuff. But yeah, New York was great, and I was in most of the time I was in New York, I was uh an architect and a technical leader, like a VP of, I think VP of IT, they called it then, but essentially VP of software development for an insurance company. And then I started a software company there and raised some money, and we had pretty good traction. And I just love New York. I mean, it was great. My office was like right on 9th and Broadway. It's right in the middle of
Real
it.
quick, Dave, what was your rough idea for your age back then when you started the company and raised your funds?
My age, what was
Yeah.
my
Yeah, kind of
um
to get perspective, like how fast did you mature to become independent entrepreneur?
yeah, I mean, I started a company when I was 21 that was a web design company and ran that for 2 years, pretty, and I paid myself. So I would call that one definition of success.
Cool.
Um, but I've always kind of been entrepreneurial. But yeah, I think around that time I would have been like 29,
Wow, that's
you know,
good.
yeah, 29. And we raised millions of dollars, and we started. And what I did is I nearshored my development team. So I had two development teams up in Syracuse, New York,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the thing is, you could find developers pretty lot cheaper than New York City, right? And I would fly up there almost every week and sit down with them. And what I found too is building developers was also cheaper and more practical than hiring full shot ringers. And so we kind of had this, in a way, a proto dojo. And like me sitting down, I'm like, okay, we're going to pair and I'm going to show you TDD. We're doing extreme programming, right? That's kind of my background. But yeah, great times in New York, awesome center of culture, everything, it's very much like, to me, New York is kind of like this
Mm-hmm.
energetic city. And it's like, when you live there on the kind of income that I was making at the time, it's like living in a submarine a little bit. You have a little tiny apartment, but it's like you're not really living for the interior apartment. You know what I mean? You're
Right.
really living for what's going outside, partying, going to shows, going to, one-off museum things. You just, it's your next door, right?
Yep.
Never would go to like, Times Square, or didn't do that. It was all about the cool stuff going on. And then, and I had a great time there. Around 2008, though, I kind of had this like, you know, decision to make, because our startup, we had some reference customers, we built it to flip it, and the kind of AIG thing sucked out the whole M&A scene, right? And so from what we were an insurance vertical, back then they called it an ISV, independent software vendor. We had this thing for workers' compensation insurance. And, one thing is the domain. I love the domain because it helped me really become a better developer in terms of like practicing domain-driven design and stuff like that. Then again, I'm not that passionate about workers' compensation insurance. You know what I mean? I see it as a necessary thing. It's just not too sexy, right? And I didn't really see where we were going, you know, in terms of flipping out, and I couldn't see me sticking in it for 5 years, you know. So I said, I'm out, right? I'm just gonna go, and started looking for jobs.
Was it a tough decision for you? Did it take
Yeah,
multiple days and weeks, or was it like kind of on the spot overnight?
it was a months-long process of recognizing, you know, what I needed to do. I mean, it was definitely accompanied some kind of depression and some burnout. You know what I mean? Like,
So body was suggesting that Dave, something is not right, not for you, right? So let's start thinking about what's going on.
yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think it's like you always look. Chris Rock has this thing. It's like any relationship that you're in, half the time of that relationship has been spent breaking up. So if you're in an 8-year relationship, that means 4 years of that have been really spent breaking up. It's just, it's like it's not,
Sinusoid, right?
yeah, it just doesn't, it's not like everything comes to you as a decisive epiphany. You know what I mean? Some things are slow to arrive at, slow thinking, right? But yeah, I mean, I was like, okay, I got to move on. And I think that was good idea. At that time, I was also really had built the most equity in my career as kind of a thought leader. I was, you know, an organizer of a big open source .NET community with, you know, there was a alt.net, and I was kind of one of the main dudes that were behind that. And we had user groups spawned all over the world. And it's like I was really riding on a high. You know, huge blog. I get 150,000 views when I posted stuff. So I mean, I was like a celebrity programmer for a minute there. And you know, I was writing MSDN magazine articles, forwards to books, and you know, it was like I speaking at all international conferences. It was awesome, right? But it was like so I'm like, I'm going to use this time to kind of cash in on that and find a good job. So I looked at a number of places. I mean, looked in Austin, London, you know, Seattle, and I think and then Atlanta, this job in Atlanta. And Atlanta's kind of like, you know, when you grow up in the North, you have a kind of a cocky bias about people in the South. You think they're kind of rednecks and, you know, a little bit backwards. And, you know, it's a terrible thing to admit, but here I am admitting it. And so I'm like, I don't know much about Atlanta, but I went to go look this company version 1, and I went down there and I just loved Atlanta. You know, I went to all these places and I was like, you know what? Atlanta's the most weird to me out of all these. Like, it's the most outside of my experience. It's a very black and white city. Like race is kind of like a thing here, and it's kind of in a way somewhat more evolved. And like that was something I wanted to learn about. It had a kind of grittiness to it that kind of felt like, okay, it wasn't a weaning off period from New York. I liked their, you know, kind of culture that they had. It was kind of the dirty South. I was like, that appealed to me. I'm like, I could get behind this. And then I found the people very welcoming. So those are all cultural things that surprised me about Atlanta. The job itself, version 1, just seemed like a pretty ideal job for me because it was kind of product development coach, and I got to be influential on product decisions, but also very influential about how, you know, our technical game was played. And so it just played, you know, just was a cool role that I could work between. And I liked the people there. And, you know, I stayed there for 6 years. So that's got to tell you something. I really learned a lot at version 1. And I think, you know, it really kind of cemented that product vibe in me, you know. And yeah, then from there I went on to, you know, left that to go consult, and you know, that's where the dojo popped up. But Atlanta, I don't regret moving to Atlanta. I met my wife here. I'm in it, you know, I'm a landowner in Atlanta, so I'm gonna probably stick around for a little bit anyway. We'll see.
Did you still miss something about New York? While you did pick up a lot of advantages of Atlanta, whatever it have to offer, do you still miss something about New York?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, New York's a wonderful place if you're rich, right? If you're loaded, it's an awesome place. right? And I was kind of scrapping it out in a startup, so I didn't quite come into wealth at that point. So I am self-made, right? It's just kind of the way it is. I'm not a trust fund baby. But what I miss, I mean, is obviously the culture is par excellence. It's like you're not you can the couple things, right? One is mobility is really high in New York, right? You can get from point A to point B if you're willing to go down in the subway and smell that smell, right? You can do it.
Say hi to
Mobility.
Reds as well, right?
Yes, exactly. Right. And the offerings, right? The what's available to you is world class. Like, if you're a foodie, it's a great place to be. If you're into music, I'm a little bit losing my hearing now. So I had my moment, right? I would go to 2 or 3 shows a week. It's if you're trying to build a career, it puts you into a hustle mode, just the vibe of it. It's like everything's a struggle in a way, and that kind of builds character. So I mean, I miss it in that regard. I mean, but I'm pretty happy where I am. I feel like Atlanta's the home for me.
Could you speak a bit more? You already started um, expressing how was your public figure playing out for you, and you've been on speaking engagement and things like that. Like for me personally, and I'm sure for other people out there, it is quite a mystery how to become a public speaker, how to become kind of famous enough to be approached by third-party people, conferences and such, and get a spot on the spotlight and talk about the topic or two. So how that process typically looks like, and what you need to possess to be approached with a speaking engagement, and what do they people pay for that
Well,
or not?
yeah. I mean, I never really got paid for speaking. I was definitely in the kind of developer conference world, whereas at least when I don't do it too much now. I do some speaking keynotes and stuff like that, but it's not a big ambition of mine. I learned that fame was never my objective, even though I kind of fell into it, and I think the reason I fell into it is I knew my shit, like at that time where I hooked into it, I was very much advanced in this idea of it's kind of a smart UIs, right? Really, but what I would call now composite user interfaces, essentially like think microservices for user experiences, where like all of your widgets can be delivered by different teams, and there's just a nice framework that handles the interaction between them. So trading desk applications would be one use case there, and I think it's now kind of called composite UIs would be the term.
Spotify comes to my mind right away, right? There's widgets on the screen that have to
Right.
do with controlling your playlist or controlling music itself and
Yep.
things like that.
Yep. Different teams might own the playhead, or different
Yep.
teams might own the playlist function. So I kind of was a early adopter in that, and I built, I mean, my product, my startup, we built as a composite UI and adopted all these Microsoft technologies. And really, what got me attention was I refused to be ignored. And I think that's a trait that I still have. Like if I want something, I will go after it. And what happened is I went to this like Microsoft like architecture conference in Redmond, and I started talking to their employees, and I realized that I'm as capable as they are, right? So kind of think getting over your own hurdles and saying, oh, well, they're from, this vendor, getting out there and just joining the community, not necessarily as a featured speaker.
Opponent, right?
Yeah. But just like being like, oh, like, okay, I have something to add here. Then the other major moment was I went to some conference and I saw these lauded speakers give a talk, and it was like just a dog shit. I mean, it was hot garbage, and they hadn't prepared. And it's like, and I've come to learn that's a type of person. There's a type of professional speaker, and I just have no interest in being that person. I'm actually interested in affecting change. But
So
I'm
you
like
results driven, right?
results driven, and I'm like, I can do this. And I went up to the organizer of the conference. I'm like, do you have another thing coming up? Can I get a speaking slot? And they're like, what's your speaking history? And I just kind of said, I've given lots of presentations for work and la la la. And I just prepared the shit out of my first talk. I fully script my talks. I memorize them. I rehearse them to where I don't need to read it anymore. That's so preparation is key for me. And then I gave a talk, and it was on its topic of composite UIs, or smart UIs at the time it was called. And it was well received. And it was at the Microsoft, headquarters in New York, in Manhattan. And there are people to notice of that and started giving me some opportunities. And I never said no to anything. I said yes to everything. I would go get on the train in New York and go out to Scranton, Pennsylvania to speak at Scranton Code Camp in front of 20 people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and then eventually I'm, at QCon running a track in a year. So I aggressively went after. Now, I also use metrics quite a bit at that time. I was using like my Twitter followers to kind of gauge. I was using lots of kind of analytics, right? On my website, and I was very metrics driven and trying to see those numbers go up. But I was obsession plays a big role in my growth. Like I get obsessed. Obsession, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if I want something, I will go deep on it. And I think I'm also like, I'm also like, I'll just say yes to everything. And you know what I mean? And then eventually I'll start to become more selective. But I think it also then kind of the dark side of that is I burn out. Like I burnt out of that. Like I was like, fuck this shit. I don't want to do this anymore. And I stopped. Right. And kind of
I read this. Go ahead, sorry.
Well, I'm just kind of like, in retrospect, I feel like there was a middle path where I could have kind of kept it more consistent, instead of being totally, let's go do 25 conferences in a year,
In one of the books, I picked up this idea, which I was thinking in the background of my head for a while, this idea of, and we talked about that with you, I remember, basically work and life balance really almost never happens. But you alluded to it from different perspective. Basically, in your life, you was able to implement your passion into your work. So you never really had to compromise, right? Basically coding and dojo and speaking was your basically passion. That's what you wanted. And you didn't feel like you've been working, although you right now saying that you got burned out, but still it was part of your day-to-day without forcing it. It was what you wanted to do anyways, right? Yeah. And what I'm talking about in the book was this concept that work-life balance rarely happens because you really have to be focusing on one thing at a time. So it could be work for a stint. Like think about like sprints when you're running them, right? Should be a sprint of work, but then normally you would lose something like on personal side or your health side. Then you switch focus. Okay, I'm focusing on health fully 100%. And then I'm focusing back on work. This way you can achieve much better results in whatever you're focusing on, because that's a single focus, single track. Obviously, I mean, it's pretty hard to implement and things happen in real life, but I think I can relate to this model versus, try to be like 50-50 or try to be like balanced. I just never could, like, realistically speaking, relate to that. Like, it just never happens. You either fully want to get results at work or whatever you pursuing career-wise, or you got where you wanted to be, but then you lacking on sleep or your energy levels or what have you. You need to travel, reset a little bit, and then you're fully traveling for like a month or something. Yeah. Where if you 50-50 model would suggest something like, you're on a laptop doing dojo in France. Well, you're not in France and you're not doing dojo, right? Like you're screwing up in both places. So I think I relate more to one thing at a time.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is what I would call mindfulness, and being in the present. And so that's something I struggle with. I'm trying to get better at it, and I have techniques or whatever, but my business partner is my life partner, right? And so it would be and we live in obviously the same house, I guess maybe not obviously, but we have a kind of, so when we're done with this call at, for me, 5 o'clock on a Friday, I'm going to go down and we're going to talk about the end of the day for 30 minutes, but then we're going to switch gears and open a bottle of wine and stop talking about work. Because if I don't, that's all our relationship becomes about, right? You know, that's just one example. And I think I like what you said. It's like, you know, I think you got to make some boundaries, right? Or what works for me anyway. I'll just say that is, you know, I want to focus on these chunks, right? I want to focus on work and making impact. And that's probably one of my bigger focuses. I am a little bit of that's kind of my main thing. Well, I also want to focus on making some music, right? As a new thing and getting back into that. I want to focus on my family, right? And I want to focus on my health, right? And so chunking up the day around that stuff is kind of one thing that I think being home and not on the road so much as, you know, COVID's been kind of a gift in that regard, and really being able to do a little more lifestyle design. But what I'd love to be able to do is when I enter that bubble, or when I enter this work bubble, I'm so focused on it. You know, I'm not thinking about, oh, my dog, the vet, bad news at the vet, and again, dog has to have a surgery, right? You know, I mean, you know, I'm thinking about that. But anyway, you know what I mean? Like I'm trying to kind of be in that
Sorry,
moment.
man.
Right? Yeah, it's all good. Now she has like an infected toe. She's got to have a toe removed. So it's not, you know, not the end of the world. But you know, I'm just trying to find a real example. But I think, yeah, mindfulness and kind of staying, you know, in the context that I am, or getting good about context switching is something that I've been terrible at as a developer. You know, like when I would be like back in the early days, I'd be coding, you know, headphones on, and it's like anyone that would touch, God forbid you touch my shoulder, you know, and be like, I mean, the anger, you know what I mean? Like, because I'm like in the zone, you know. I've gotten better about that stuff, you know, but I don't know. I don't know if that kind of
By the way,
yeah.
whenever you feel like you need to stop, let me know so I don't really use too much of your time.
Well, let's take one more topic and then let's say, hey, maybe we come around and do a part two. Maybe I can interview you.
I still have plenty before you interview me, but we can mix and match as well. But I
Okay.
definitely looking forward for part two of this. Um, could you talk about how does it feel like to run a business? So you had early experience at 21, you had big things at 29, and obviously right now you're doing big things in life from work perspective. Approaching potential clients and negotiating deals, especially during dynamic situation, economically speaking, right? Even right now, today, Goldman Sachs cut 10% of staff. And all across the board, tech companies are doing haircuts. So could
Yeah.
you speak about that, how to navigate various turmoils, uptime, downtimes, and so forth?
Yeah. Um, the best advice I ever got was, you know, this is just good advice. And, but if you have debt, pay it off, you know, obviously, you know, I have a mortgage that was locked in at the lowest rate, you know, historical rate or whatever. I'm not necessarily going to pay that off because it's cheap money. But if you have high interest debt, you know, that's going to prevent you from having, um, you know, being able to weather storms, right? And I'm saying even my consulting, let's just take my consulting career. It started like in 2014, and there were some lean times, you know what I mean, where I couldn't find work, you know, or I had to really, it was boom bust for a minute. Now I'm a little more cash flow level, and we're a little bit smarter, and we invest in sales and marketing and stuff like that. And we're getting returns from that. But you have to be able to, like,
Have a
especially because
cushion, right?
you have a cushion, you know. I mean, I think 6 months of expenses would be pretty ideal. Um, I didn't start with that, but I got to that, you know, and I think learning to live in more meager boom bust cycles definitely changed my relationship with money. I mean, I'm much more frugal than I was. I was just like, you know, kind of a spender before, you know, a great sneaker collection, but you know, now I'm a little bit more like, you know, I won't say miserly, but I'm like, you know, I invest more, I save more, you know what I mean? So, um, but I think that having that kind of base is really helpful. And of course, you know, sometimes like in my prior startup, we had, several $1 million, right? And so we had a
And it
controller as
wasn't
well.
yours, right? Worst case, it's
Right.
not yours.
Right. But I mean, I was making okay salary. Maybe not by New York City standards, but like I was able to live on it pretty comfortably, right? But I think having that kind of thing is really important too, because I mean, I'm in a services business, right? I have a consulting firm, and there will be boom bust cycles, or there will be moments where, you know, like with the pandemic, where people clamp, they say, well, we can't continue this, it's just too risky. So you have to be able to kind of weather those peaks and valleys a little bit. And I think if you can weather those peaks and valleys, you can grow your brand equity, right? And I think the companies that really manage to do that and survive in that, specifically, I'm talking about consulting and services companies that are able to do that, tend to grow their book of business pretty well, right? And so that's kind of the biggest thing. The other thing I think is, okay, here's a basic one. Separate your business finances from your personal finances. Okay. I mean, this is like every web, how do I start a business? It's going to have like number 2, right, on that listicle. But let me tell you, I mean, I ran everything off of one Amex card. And at the end of the year, trying to separate my business expenses from my personal expenses, it's a fucking nightmare, right? And so just saying, clean separation, just do it. The third thing I would say is, mostly for services and consulting, let's face facts. Inbound marketing probably isn't going to work for you. Not say you shouldn't experiment with it. We're trying to experiment with it, but it's really networking is how you build those businesses, period. Right. You may get it up off the ground where inbound marketing and like freebies and like all these kind of, growth hacks might start to work for you a little bit, or sponsor, you get money, you can sponsor conferences or have those kind of Marcom expenses. But when you're just starting out, you really need to, your network is where business is going to come from. And so things like when you have a successful engagement with someone, asking them, hey, can you, introduce me to a few of your peers and say, what we had with the project, and then nurturing that. Sometimes you're not going to get responses, but like I just had this happen yesterday. I sent an email and I'm like, hey, just doing some quarterly one planning and wonder if you had any projects in mind. That having that chutzpah, which doesn't come natural to me, but having that, I came back and they're like, we need to spend $100,000 this year. I'm like, sure, I'm right here. Let's do it. Oh, let's turn it actually into $500,000 thing next year. So looking at customer lifetime value, networking, that's really huge. And if I am not a natural networker, Dimitri, you got to kind of like claw through the 8 rings to find me or whatever.
I think that's why we kind of clicked early on, because I think our, how you say, how we built is very similar. Like, you're introverted, extrovert. Well, you're extroverted, introvert. I'm similar way. Like I can find a groove. I can really perform. Doesn't matter what side of the crowd. But then typically my day to day is not large crowds, not speaking all day long. I'm more like think, read, write, and do something more quieter activity. Back to you.
Yeah, no, I mean it's at that, and it's just having this kind of getting over yourself and like saying, I use like a HubSpot CMS, and I'm just like, just staying on that is been huge. Putting out a newsletter, I get business from it all the time. So it's a slow roll, but if you don't stay on it, that roll will stop really quickly. Yep. So I think that's kind of the biggest lesson. The other thing is, the last thing, and then I'll stop dispensing wisdom here, but the team that you have is really critical. And by that, I mean, everyone will say this, but find a CPA that knows their shit, right? And if you don't know how to bookkeep, find a bookkeeper, right? If you find a good graphic designer and find a good attorney, and that's our team. Really, that's kind of how and then we'll have special projects here and there. But we go to these people over and over again, and we've gotten great advice from them, and it's worth every penny. So putting that team together and getting those connections, and but make sure those people give you advice, right? Not just, it's kind of like they're not just necessarily performing a transactional service, but they're the people that are on that team that we found, and we've changed them, we fired many of each, right, to get to what we're at now, is they're cool to collaborate with us. They're cool to give us broader advice beyond their little domain. And they're very proactive in helping us, grow.